I'm gonna get us started. I know I have the task of getting everyone ready after lunch. Fortunately, I was a teacher for a couple of years, so I'm used to that. But I am so pleased to see you all here today. My name is Maddie Devine. I'm the first year here at Fuqua, who has been helping to organize the social track for this conference. And I'm very excited to not only see all of you in this room, but also to see these wonderful panelists. And I'm going to hand it over to John Troy, the Executive Director of the Southern Office for Education Pioneers, who's going to be our moderator today, and who will get us started.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. It feels great to be back here at Fuqua. I am a class of 09 alum, and so it's hard to believe it has been close to 4 years since I graduated. It feels great to be back, as I said, and I'm thrilled to see so many people here today that are interested in learning more about education and education reform. I, as Maddie said, am the Southern Region Executive Director of Education Pioneers. I've been with Education Pioneers since I graduated, originally overseeing our DC office and now our Southern Region. And for those of you who aren't familiar, we bring in top talent for outside the classroom roles. And so we recruit a lot of folks just like you to come work in education. And it's still actually not too late. We are growing quickly in the South. And so we've decided to open it back up because we are growing so aggressively that we need even more folks. So see me if you were interested in a placement with Education Pioneers afterwards. So I had to do the plug at the beginning. But today we're talking about education reform and what the realities are on the ground. And so we have an all-star panel here of folks who really talk about the work that they're doing in the education sector. And so I'm going to kick it off with each of you introducing yourselves. And so maybe Chris, why don't you kick it off with just a brief intro?
Unorthodox. I expected you last. So I'm Chris Tessone. I'm a 2011 alum of the daytime program here. I'm currently Chief Operating Officer of the See Forever Foundation and the Maya Angelou Public Charter Schools in DC. So we're a network of 4 schools, 3 charter and 1 non-charter in DC that serve primarily students who are disconnected youth who have not been successful in other educational settings. We have a high population of previously incarcerated students. Before See Forever, I was the Chief Financial Officer of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is a national K-12 education policy think tank based in DC.
Great.
Hi, I'm Tim Field, and I'm actually based here nearby in Chapel Hill. And I currently work for Public Impact, which is a education policy management consulting firm that's based in Chapel Hill and does a lot of interesting work nationally. That's a recent role for me. I came from KIPP Foundation for a few years, and I was a regional director of the foundation and worked in support of our KIPP schools in the Southeast. So did a lot of work supporting, did some coaching, consulting, and kind of a quality oversight role with KIPP schools. And prior to that, I worked for the Philadelphia School District and came into that work as a road resident, so some of you might be familiar with that program. Worked there for 5 years and did a lot of work both with human capital and how we support teachers, how we select principals, how we develop principals, and then for several years in charter authorization and school turnarounds. So we started an approach of charter authorization where we're really converting family district schools into charter schools. And I was there for the development of that program. It's now in its 4th year, so they've had several years now of converting family schools to successful charters. Happy to be here.
My name is Elliot Sanchez. I am the founder of mSchool, an organization based in New Orleans, and we help local community after-school centers start their own accredited, publicly funded micro schools, even if they've never had any education background. So we are a fully authorized entity, and we've been in pilot for about a year, and in the fall we'll take our first class of about 500 students full-time in math and some other extracurriculars. I started as a teacher in New Orleans, doing education research in New Orleans prior to Katrina, and then teaching afterwards. Before founding mSchool, I was the executive director of the portfolio office in the Recovery School District. So managed the charter oversight and program portfolio for the only majority charter district in the country. We have 85% of our students in public charter schools this year. And prior to that, I worked at the State Department of Education doing some internal consulting and in our statewide school turnaround and innovation office. Excited to share the experience with you.
Sure.
So right now I work as a policy analyst at Education Sector. It's a policy group in DC that does both K-12 and higher education policy. I started my education work doing Teach for America in Eastern North Carolina. I was a high school English teacher for 3 years. Following that, I came to Duke and went to school across the road at the Public Policy School. And then after I graduated there, I came to work at Education Sector, where I focus primarily on teacher and leader quality issues.
Great. So as you can imagine, as the moderator, I have a few questions to get us started here, but go ahead and get the wheels turning about what questions you might want to ask, and I'll turn it over to you all here about halfway through. So first question, when you hear education reform, what does that mean to you, and what is the goal of education reform from your perspective? And anyone can start.
It's used a lot, right? So I mean, I think that term can mean a whole bunch of things. It can just mean change, which can be good and bad. And I think, I think there's been a wave of reform that has happened. Starting maybe for the work maybe we've done, has been more maybe that NCLB and this real focus on accountability and cranking up the heat on school accountability, and it's precipitated a whole bunch of changes. Now, some good, maybe some bad. I think one of the risks I've seen, and there's always an imperative for change. The house is burning. There's so many examples of failing schools and failing communities that there's always this imperative to do something dramatic and something very different. I think the challenge often becomes in education reform is how you do it smart and how you do it so sustainable. And I've seen examples of it not done well, and examples where it has worked well. So there's many ways you could take that question. I'll stop there. That's my first response to it.
I think it's interesting you talk about the NCLB-driven accountability focus and that urgency.
And can you explain what No Child? I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Can you explain what NCLB is?
No Child Left Behind. It was the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so kind of the big federal education appropriations bill. And there's 2001 written for NCLB, but there's been no reauthorization as of late. So we're kind of in a strange limbo right now where, as opposed to being able to compromise and pass a new bill, right now the Department of Education has said, because we've not gotten a new bill in so long, we'll write you waivers. So you don't have to follow the law, just do what you need as the state if we approve it. And it's kind of right now this strange kind of incubation experimentation phase. And hopefully we'll have a kind of a grand compromise over what the next federal landscape of education will look like soon. But since this 2001 overhaul and push for real accountability on data in the core curriculum, I think education reform has gone to mean kind of high stakes testing, pushing for lots of things that do that, to then driving those through structural reforms. And then now I think there's kind of this growing dissatisfaction. I don't know that it's a majority of people yet, but I think there's starting to be kind of a pendulum swing back to say, we know that the core skills are critical, but our education system is really founded on the idea that you offer an equitable experience that prepares students for life, and that can mean more than just the test scores at the end of the day. And so I think we're starting to get to a place where education reform means how do you go and build an academically rigorous system, but also not do it at the expense of just making students test-taking machines. And I think that's where the really interesting work lies now.
Right, we've seen this big education policy reform push in the last maybe 4 or 5 years in particular, and now we're kind of reaching this implementation phase where the rubber's really hitting the road, and we're seeing things like Common Core Standards, which is kind of a governor-led initiative to have common standards across many states. We're seeing these things that seem to have great promise when they were just policies being implemented, and people saying, maybe these aren't quite as good as we thought they were. Maybe instead of an 100% kind of policy, this is maybe 65 or 70. And how, are we making the right moves here? You see this around teacher evaluation too. And how do we kind of redirect things or provide kind of support in order to make these policies that had such great promise actually come to fruition?
Yeah, I think the other piece of the equation is data. I mean, this is becoming increasingly data-driven conversation, and we now have a really robust, now that we have sort of all this NCLB data from the last 12 years, we have this growing conversation about what is school quality, what is teacher quality, the data that we gather is not very sensitive to growth at the very low end of the spectrum, and also not very sensitive to growth for like the high flyers, gifted kids. So now there has to be a conversation around, are schools that look bad on paper truly bad? Are schools that look great on paper really adding value, or are they simply sort of coasting on the good outcomes that their students come in kind of poised to deliver? So I think that's part of the conversation as well as the data piece.
Thanks. So the conference today, all the students who are attending, they want to have an impact with their careers. And so that's part of the reason why they're attending the conference today. But there are a lot of different ways to do that, and you can see that from all the different sessions that are on the agenda. All of you chose education as the field in which you wanted to have an impact versus any of the other worthy causes out there. And I'm curious if each of you could state, a little bit about why you chose to work in education, to add some perspective to the students here who might say, I want to make an impact with my career, but I don't really know which sector I might want to do that.
Sure. Well, I can start. So when I was in college, I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. I worked with prison education and trying to ensure that while people were incarcerated, they had access to both high school and higher education opportunities, because that's really one of the kind of key things that we've seen that can reduce recidivism, can reduce people going back into jail after they're released. And through that work, it really became apparent to me that I was really kind of reaching students, I guess, at the end of the kind of school to prison pipeline. And so I wanted to kind of go back to the beginning and see if I could, through my work in policy and whatever else down the road, kind of change the pipeline, change that road from the beginning. And so that's what propels me in my work.
I had the great fortune to get to meet and speak with Jonathan Kozol in 2004, right before Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And I had known my entire life growing up in Louisiana that New Orleans School of Business, I actually had no idea what that looked like in person. And having gone through this experience and then having seen both the complete devastation of the city and also kind of the need to really be bold and rebuild in a way that was unprecedented at that point. To me, it was just an opportunity that I couldn't turn away from. And then I think what's kept me intrigued and kept me just intellectually curious, in addition to being able to feel good about the impact that we're seeing already, is the fact that education is kind of a uniquely, it's really about human development, and it's about how we feel about human development in our societal structures, right? We actually have big sections of our work that are making decisions about what we value in people, how we want our society to look, and how that's reflected in the way that kids spend their days for 8 hours a day, and the opportunity to kind of be the change and the mechanisms for change long-term in society, while alleviating a lot of immediate suffering at the same time, is just this dynamic where I think education is the most exciting space to be kind of out of all of the social impact realm.
I think for me, I lived in Philadelphia for 11 years, went to grad school, and maybe not dissimilar from Duke, perhaps. I just had this great school, all these great people, and there's an incredibly needy community that was right there. And when I lived there after school, I loved the city, but also I think just grew to appreciate just how needy the city was and just how much poverty and challenges there were. So when I, kind of got out of consulting and wanted to do something that I felt like I had more of a real rewarding work, I think I looked at a variety of things, but when it came down to what's going to have an impact on the long-term vitality and health of the city, focusing on education and the kids was just a very powerful and satisfying approach. And I think it helped that there was this new road residency program that allowed me to kind of make that transition. That's not an easy transition to make, to leave, to get into a new field.
For me, so I grew up in generational poverty in rural America. And I had great parents, parents who cared a lot about our education, who set high standards for us and kept us on the right track. But I know from sort of looking back that if I had not also had great educators and great schools, I don't think that my family would have made a difference. And the research shows that after sort of family and parent effects, school effects are the next most determinative question in someone's background in terms of where they end up in life. So it's very personal for me. In terms of, just selfishly though, I love kids, so it's wonderful being around kids in the building all the time. The other piece is that leaving Fuqua, Fuqua was the most sort of diverse and high-charged and interesting group of folks I had ever been around. I think the education space as well is like incredibly diverse in terms of people's backgrounds. Even going beyond the MBA experience, people also come from very different sort of academic backgrounds and different work backgrounds as well. So that's something that keeps me energized and which I really love, is just working with a very broad array of folks in the funder space, in the school space, and the policy space, who are all coming together to solve a really tough but really rewarding problem.
It's an enormous field. I don't think I fully appreciate it. I think if you look at what we spend in education, that gives you some sense, but it is an enormous field. So for those who are thinking about education, there is a lot you can get into. We haven't even talked about some of the exciting things, and I think some stuff that Elliot's doing with just what technology can mean and what that could look like. There's a lot of promise and potential, but it's a lot of work to execute it. So there's a lot of exciting things happening in the field.
I think it'll change more than almost any other field in our economy over the next generation. I think education 20 years from now will look almost nothing like education has looked for potentially, hundreds of years previously. Before we even had an American public education system, I think there were patterns in place that are just ripe for disruption at this moment in history for a lot of very specific reasons that are coming together. So I can't imagine a more exciting place to kind of have a front row seat to historical developments in the way that it's going to.
And we're talking about K-12 kind of better on
Yes.
lens. I think higher ed too, a lot going on there. I think probably this panel is a little bit on the K-12 side. But,
How about K-20?
yeah, we'll talk K-20 we'll start saying.
K-20. Right. Well, let's actually build off this theme that was coming up here. So what do you see as the key trends that are developing in the education sector? And then fast forward 10, 20 years, if you had to take a guess at how the education sector might look at that time, what are your thoughts?
I think coming to terms with the multiplicity of models is by far the big. We've had this sort of cookie cutter system where, even well-heeled schools in suburban America in very fundamental ways looked just like, resource poor performing schools in the inner city. And that's rapidly becoming not the case. So I'm on the board of a Montessori charter school in DC that is trying to bring Montessori education to underserved Latino and Black communities in DC. You have online schooling. Rocket Ship is trying to open. Rocket Ship is a network primarily California-based of hybrid learning charter schools that do some classroom work, but some work on the computer. I think, across the board, authorizers, state departments of education, everyone is starting to try to figure out what this looks like, and it drives, I think, very difficult but very rewarding conversations about what school quality looks like.
I think the interesting part is when we talk, especially about models, right? I think models are the key piece here, because models are kind of the way we talk about the different takes people have brought to the idea of school and what school can look like. And I think the most exciting part for me is the fact that with things like Rocket Ship, with things like the advancement of online learning, whether it be Duke's first move in September, I believe, or other universities which are putting their entire catalogs online, I think we're reaching a point where the entire concept of school itself is now actually beginning to be up for discussion. And I think that's the part that's most interesting to me, is the fact that we are starting to broaden from a school-based conversation and classroom-based conversation to a real deep education-based conversation. And the question then is, within that system, right, how does one student's experience make sense, but also what are the possibilities now that you can have access to incredible amounts of information at the touch of a button? What is the purpose of certain classes if the way that we think about retrieving and verifying facts is entirely shifted from the way that it was when we started schools themselves, right? There's a change in the way that we have started to interact with information in the economy and information in our day-to-day lives that I think is yet to ripple down through the way we prepare people to be productive adults. And I think when that happens, it is going to disrupt more than just the way that we structure schools. It's going to disrupt the way we actually structure education and the way we think about our responsibility for it.
Well, and just to add on that a little bit, and more broadly, how we think about school funding and how we use teachers. One thing, not to steal your thunder a little bit, but one thing that Public Impact talks a lot about is expanding the reach of excellent teachers. So using technology to, maybe you have one really tremendously excellent English teacher in high school. Well, maybe that teacher can teach more students, and then you use the other teachers as more kind of teacher's assistants who can do some more one-on-one work. So figuring out how to use technology as a lever, as a smart lever, is incredibly important. I think right now we're seeing a lot of people throwing darts at the technology board, and some of them are hitting the bullseye, but a lot aren't. There was an editorial in the New York Times a couple days ago talking about online education and about how it's not serving students well in the higher ed space. And I think that is completely true. But that's not to say that it won't be an incredible lever for student learning several years down the road. And I think we're definitely on the road to getting there.
I think what's happened in the last 10, 15 years is we've seen changes in the governance structure of schools, whereas before it was all public monopoly and private schools. You are seeing, with charters and other mechanisms, you're starting to see some variation in models. It's still very reliant on human capital and the quality of those teachers. And I think what's going to need to happen is technology's got to improve. So you've got to have, you want curriculum that's going to adapt to the kids so they can interact with it and it's fun. Why do kids so excited in school in first grade? By the time in sixth grade, they're bored out of their mind. We got to make it more interactive. But the human capital part of schooling has to marry up with the technology. We got to figure out, because if you're not going to, the need for great teachers is not going to go away. But what that role looks like probably needs to change to better leverage, those out there in terms of technology and curriculum.
I think the best example for kind of trying to imagine the 10, 20-year perspective is to think about how medicine has changed over the past 100 years, or maybe even just the past 50 years. But to think about the idea that we currently have, in the United States at least, so many different options, opportunities, ways that are expanding, whether it's through personalization and augmenting of smartphones to be actual medical devices, whether it's through being able to go to a minute clinic and receive flu shots and actually first-line care, or urgent cares, which are entirely unaffiliated from what we think of traditional hospitals and doctors' offices, and then specialist clinics, and how the relationship between some of the larger research hospitals ties into patient care. And then to think that in education, we're essentially coming from a system where we have a similarly complex structure, but one where right now the options are pretty much all doctor's offices, and we go there every day, or at least the kids do. And we are about to go from having a doctor's office where kids go every day to having a similar ripple through where those options are not going to be standardized, right? They're going to be very dependent. I think sometimes you'll have people who are incredible teachers and whose human capital will be increasingly important. And I think also you're going to have a huge expansion of the opportunities for learning, because there will be many cases where people are not as important in that system. And I think it's a thing that lots of people in education are still grappling with. But when we talk about blended classrooms, where some students are on computers part of the day and they're learning from real teachers most of the time, medicine is now blended, and we take it for granted. But there are only 100 dedicated blending learning schools in the United States of 100,000. And I think the question is, how quickly will we get to 100,000? And then how quickly will we get to 200,000? Because now we realize they don't have to be the same size schools. They can break out, and they can be smaller and more interesting things that meet more specific needs in kind of a more frequent way. That's the part that I think is most exciting in this, is that we've seen it happen in other industries, but now we've just progressed further along in all those same technologies, and that will be the moment when it hits education, now that it's more advanced.
Great. So to bring it down a little bit more to the ground level now, so thinking about the work you're doing at your actual organizations, what are the greatest challenges that you and your organizations are facing right now?
This is a kind of a new challenge I'm experiencing working in public impact, is that we are working in support of state education agencies. And for those who are familiar with Race to the Top, there's been this big influx of federal money that is really challenging states to do some innovative things. I mean, you could argue how innovative it really is, but what they are definitely doing is taking on a new role. The state traditionally was, the state education agencies traditionally were we get money from the feds, we dole it out to schools, and we monitor it, make sure it's being used appropriately, and that was all they did. So one of the things I'm doing now in my work is really to help some of these states who have signed up to do all these very new things to actually have the capacity to do them, because they were not designed to be innovative, performance management driven organizations. They were designed to monitor and do compliance. So I think, one thing I've seen is like, wow, it's a new role for state agencies and they don't know how to do it yet. Some are getting there and some are not. So that's one dynamic. A lot of things going on, but that's one dynamic you're seeing. Again, part of that's driven by the federal funding and the federal programs, and it's a new role for state agencies.
I think just to piggyback on that, it's interesting that, SCAs and other sort of establishment organizations are not doing a great job coming out of their compliance-oriented past, but organizations that were started as very dynamic and very disruptive are now struggling with becoming compliance-oriented and stuck in the mud. So I see that internally. We are now a 15-year-old organization. We struggle with thinking what is next on the horizon, how do we best serve our students and not just do the same old. Our authorizer and a number of other authorizers around the country, I think, are struggling with the reality that some of the, frankly, crap that was on districts' plates that they did not do very well with is not something that's endemic to the district model. It's something that's endemic to our own concerns about education. So we are now seeing more compliance stuff around special education, around our processes on discipline, on attendance, and it's, to some extent it's a bummer because I think charters do well with autonomy in most cases, and we're losing some of that autonomy. But it's also understandable because just as Kaya Henderson, who's the superintendent, who's the chancellor of DCPS, is worried about a post article about some crazy discipline blow up in one of her schools, there's every reason that the chairman of the public charter school board should be worried about a crazy post article coming out about one of our schools, even though he just oversees us from a governance perspective and doesn't actually run our school. So I think that's natural, and we have to figure out a way to continue to disrupt and continue to push out of that muck. But it's tough. That's a day-to-day challenge.
I think the regulation theme it is without a doubt the hardest challenge. And having gotten a chance to see it from the district and the state side, and now as an actual education service provider, right? I think the reason is because for so long there has just been kind of a tacit understanding that if there's a problem, there needs to be a control, there needs to be a process. And I think it's a very easy thing politically to make rules about. So if a legislator is going to say, there was a problem, we need to make sure this never happens again, there's almost no argument that you don't want bad things to happen to children ever again. And so I think it is rushed to kind of assemble this very strange, overlapping, contradictory, and now incredibly oppressive system of requirements that sometimes actively fight against the outcomes they were originally stated to create. I think special education law is one such example where you see people who are doing fantastic things to take students who were considered disabled previously and have them be full-fledged students, members of their community, not treat them like they have disabilities, and then they perform like they never did because they don't. But to have to fight against a system that will, in the name of trying to do what's right for students, keep them in that classification and keep them as a special ed student, because otherwise they don't get enough money. So if you take them out, they get full rights as a student, but if you put them in, you get more money to meet their needs. And on top of all of these structural signals about what a school should and shouldn't do, the reporting requirements and keeping up with, even if you've done everything correctly, have you told all the right people in the right way? Because if not, it's almost as bad as if you never did it at all. Maybe worse, right? And this combination is one of the main reasons why I think education has been so recalcitrant, right? So resistant to some of the big shifts. Because in our current role, we are trying to go out and basically make people very close to the students, either their parents or community leaders, responsible for some portion of their education, and in a very real way. And to do that, we are essentially playing the barrier between them and the avalanche of requirements and potential lawsuits and legal fees and all of these things that would otherwise kind of squash an impulse that I think is very, very overdue for having a more real voice in that conversation. And so I think as we start to clear up some of the questions about having an irrational system to one that actually more reflects what we think we want now, I think that will open the doors as each of those kind of layers gets peeled back and rethought and again, done well. Not saying we don't regulate school, right, but to think that we can get to a happy medium, I think we'll start to really see the beginning of flourishing of the models that we've kind of seen in their infancy now.
Well, and I think to play a little bit more of a skeptical role, I think that a lot of these regulations, particularly in terms of like teacher certification, those sorts of things, have been to protect students. You know, we want to make sure that our teachers go in with a bachelor's degree. We want to make sure that they are highly qualified, although that really is kind of a meaningless term. So these regulations have been put in place for a good reason, and so taking them away completely in preparation for this kind of system that we want in terms of school choice, in terms of different models, in terms of kind of letting schools and parents decide what they want for their students is a great thing, but if we take away all the regulations now, that assumes that those great circumstances are already in place, and they're not. And so kind of releasing regulation as autonomy can be taken is important. So it's important, I think, to have a balance. You see this in alternative teacher certification. On the one hand, some people just want there to be no teacher certification. You know, schools will make their own decisions as to which teachers they think are best for their students, regardless of background. But I don't know if I would want a system like that. I want some expectation, some certification, but what we have certainly isn't the right thing either. So trying to negotiate that is a real challenge.
I think it depends, though. I mean, you know, there was this sort of rhetoric around charter schools that if you had schools that didn't have unionized teachers, teachers wouldn't want to teach there. The teachers who did teach there would be mistreated. That's really not turned out to be true. And in fact, high-performing charter networks we're certainly able to attract teachers from surrounding districts at less pay with fewer benefits because they value the autonomy. So I think it really depends. I mean,
well, I think you said it exactly right. And the keywords are high-performing charter schools. We've also seen a tremendous number of charter schools mismanage their funds, treat their students poorly, serve as kind of white flight places for white families that don't want to be in integrated schools. So this is exactly the point, right? High-performing charter schools should have that autonomy because they're serving their students well. They're places where teachers want to teach. But that's not the market right now. DC is a little bit of a different circumstance. New Orleans is different. There's a couple other places like that. I taught in Eastern North Carolina with a couple phenomenal KIPP schools. So I mean, great charter schools deserve that autonomy, but not every charter school is great. In fact, I would say most aren't.
Well, so one of the interesting things about charter schools is that you'll find, on average, right, they are just about the same as regular schools. And New Orleans is I think, a little bit above average. You'll see that in other places that have really invested heavily in a high-performing sector. But charter schools, I think, fundamentally, the only thing that they are really different about generally is the fact that they're removed from some of these constraints of the system we have, right? And so your point is well taken, because when you create small pockets of saying, our system has a lot of issues to deal with, go create a charter school, you operate independently from a lot of those same constraints. What you're going to have is, you're going to have a mix. You're going to have some that do well and some that do poorly. And the charter school's advantage, the only inherent advantage, is that you can close down a charter school and you can't close down a district school. And New Orleans has been incredibly rigorous about closing down 10% of the lowest performing charter schools every single year, replacing them, getting a random distribution on a normal curve of quality, and then continuing to close those bottom ones. That is an incredibly disruptive process for communities and families. It is an incredibly difficult one to live with, but it is also mathematically going to get you better schools than you had before. And the difference is that if you allow those pockets, you are going to see wide variations of what happens. And I think the idea about regulations is not necessarily to try to remove them and build something coherent right on the run, but I think what it is to say is that if you don't allow those pockets of place, it's the chicken and the egg, right? You can say we want a good system in place to catch them when they land, and we can also say, well, we can't build that until we know what it looks like to do it, right? So I think if there are ways to, in a controlled way, start to allow for flexibility on small scales, there is going to be a need to be incredibly diligent to make sure that there is accountability for that. And that will not always be an easy process. There's not political will in a lot of places. But when the situation is dissatisfactory enough for everybody involved, and you have that, then I think you have the real opportunity to go in and say, now that we've seen the difference, maybe we can allow more of that flexibility and we know what we're looking for next time. And that kind of gradual release, I think, is going to be key to seeing, avoiding having to kind of blow out of proportion.
I think the Achilles heel of charter movement as being a, to be what it could have been is the low quality of authorization. Like I don't think charter authorizes, and what you describe essentially is a more effective form of authorizing in New Orleans. You see that in others in DC too as a better form of authorizing. And I was in Philadelphia and gosh, it was done poorly for many, many years, and a lot of mediocrity to pop up, and that creates a whole bunch of challenges. What charter is, even if they're authorized well, what they don't do yet is solve the human capital problem, which is that, until you get, and right now, like our teachers are, if you look at like the quartiles of performance on the SAT, which, you know, it's not a great test, but it's a reflective maybe of how academically accomplished a student is in high school. Our teachers come from the bottom quartile. Like that's the average. I mean, like we're not attracting, you know, the best and brightest. So charter schools have not solved yet that, like, you got to have great teachers, and like that's still the challenge. You know, we've got to solve that through making it a more attractive profession. We've got to maybe solve that from changing the model, you know, whether it's technology or through different school designs.
Yeah, the other thing I would say about charters is, I mean, you're absolutely right that authorizers in a lot of places are terrible. I mean, Ohio tried this sort of completely, to your point, like this completely laissez-faire approach to charter authorizing. And the VP for Ohio at Fordham, when I was there, was quoted in the papers as saying that Ohio charters were a laughing stock for a decade because they were, I mean, the authorizers did nothing. They collected their 2%, they let whatever schools do whatever they wanted, and charters really sucked in Ohio. I would say, though, that it's very hard to do a good job of telling ex ante which schools will and won't be good. And you have a really serious, in places that have authorizers with a higher bar, we haven't solved the problem that some kids respond really well to the national models like KIPP and stuff like that, and some don't. And closing some bad schools means a bad school is gone. Closing some schools that look bad on paper means that you've just pushed out the kids who were not better kids in a system. So, I mean, thinking from the perspective of Maya Angelou, entry for another alternative ed school in DC in the charter sector is just almost impossible. Like, we turn out, like, more of our kids graduate than the average for, like, Ward 7 in DC. Many, many, many more of our kids go into college and persist in college than would be predicted. We don't do well on the high-stakes state tests. And so we look like, I mean, we're now classified alternative ed, so we're no longer a tier 3 or lowest tier charter school. But that becomes a really tough proposition. And I think it's very hard to imagine why somebody would go, you know what, Maya's doing a great job in Ward 7, but there's lots of underserved kids in Ward 8. I want to start an alternative ed school. It would be crazy. It's very hard to hang on. So I think that question is tough.
Great. I'll also chime in on Education Pioneer's greatest challenge, because I think it relates a lot to folks here. I'd say our greatest challenge is a typical business challenge. If you have a great product that you've done on a smaller scale, and now you want to scale it. You can see that all across the business sector. Organizations that have done it on a smaller level, and now they want to scale it, and then what are your challenges when you do that is the quality piece. And so that's one that we right now are facing, is we want to scale to bring 10,000 leaders into the education sector. We brought 1,600 in our first 10 years, and we want to bring in 8,400 in our second 10 years to reach 10,000 total. And how do you do that? And it's if you've read Jim Collins, The Genius of the And. You know, how do you do that? And quality goes up instead of and quality goes down. We're all familiar with some of those struggles as you've seen great organizations scale and then their product goes down. So just a point that you face some of the same challenges in the education sector that you might in other parts of just the business sector as a whole. Another question I wanted to throw out there. So times are tough economically. We don't have a ton of money now. People are tightening budgets, cutting back on expenses. And you see it, in some states they've cut education expenditures. So I'm curious, when you look at the education reform movement as a whole, how is it responding well, or not well, how is it responding to these cuts in budgets at these tougher financial times? And any advice that you think in terms of how things should be moving forward?
I would say it's not responding very well. So I did a lot of work on this when I was at Fordham. Pensions is one thing that I worked on a lot. Pension systems are in disastrous shape. My mother-in-law's in the Illinois teacher retirement system. The legislature's been using it as a piggy bank for 40 years. The responses are like trim here, shave here, not in a smart way. So I think in terms of the public funding picture, and on a large scale, the cuts have actually not been that big, but the responses have just been really, really dumb. Let's cut art and PE. Let's not think through smart ways to restructure. I think there have been some promising things to come out of that. So Rhode Island is another state that was in disaster shape with its pension. The state treasurer there used that opportunity to completely restructure the way they did public sector retirement. She's likely to win the race for governor in a year because she did such a great job of fixing the state. The other thing I would say is the private funder environment, the foundation environment, is undergoing a really interesting and a shift that I'm very ambivalent about, which is using the situation created by scarce resources to be much more data-driven and much more outcomes-focused, which can be very good. I think there's been a lot more targeted giving as opposed to like, I went there, I saw the cute kids, I'm going to write them a $100,000 check.
Right.
But it has also meant, on the panel you and I were on with Allison Chancellor from KIPP in DC, we talked about like venture capital in terms of like doing really risky things, trying interesting experiments has dried up, the timeline shortened. So you have, I won't name the funder, but you have crazy things like a large-scale experiment with how to reform high schools that was on a 3-year grant timeline. If you remember, high school is 4 years. So there's been this sort of spreadsheet-driven or MBA-driven like approach to philanthropy, which I think is very ambiguous, and how that shakes out. I mean, philanthropy dollars are actually a small portion of the about $700 billion that we spend on education in a year, but I think it's been high impact in places, so that's an interesting question.
Other thoughts on tighter budgets?
Honestly, Chris said everything I was going to say. No,
I did do that for like 18 months at Fordham, so I was a bit of a rumor on that
all of
question.
that. I did a report on Rhode Island's pension reform, and Gina Raimondo, the general treasurer, is just like so impressive. And the fact that she cut pensions and basically made everyone hurt, taxpayers, retirees, current teachers, and they're still giving her the highest approval ratings, is really a testament to her skills. I think she's just the best.
The only thing I think is interesting to add is to start with the fact that you talked about research, development, venture, this kind of funding. Traditionally, any kind of R&D, any kind of exploratory push has been an afterthought in education in a way that's almost unparalleled in any other sector. I think far less than 2%. I forget reading the numbers, but people talk about 2% at the federal level for sure, and probably much less at the state level, going to any kind of research about what is really going to be the thing that helps us get through the next set of challenges, like say non-discretionary, funding commitments, pension systems, and the same kind of things that we talk about in the federal budget, right? So the question is, without having made that investment, now we're at a place where we are having budget crises. But I think the interesting part is that we're not having problems funding the education of students in some universal kind of absolute concrete way. What we're having problems funding is the structures we've built around education. And if you think about, when we talk about $700 billion, 80 to 90% of every dollar spent in a school goes to salary and benefits of people. 80 to 90%. So when you talk about everything else that goes in, building up the insurance costs, curriculum, training, right? You're talking about this tiny fraction. And the idea that if we can think of ways that change our human capital dynamics and our human capital cost structures, education is not actually a critically expensive part of the economy by necessity. It is such because we've made it such. And I think that's the important distinction. They start to get into the next third, fourth, fifth round of fiscal crises at state levels and at local levels, and cities that go bankrupt, and counties that just have nothing to do. Philadelphia, as an example, right? As we start to look at these problems, I think we will be forced into solutions that otherwise we just have not been willing to consider. And I'm not saying they will all be good, but I do think it's going to force us to kind of have some of this forward-thinking research and development thought that we've just put off for so long in the past.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with Ballmill's cost disease, as wages increase and as productivity increases, you have this problem where services are more expensive to deliver, right? Because human beings are more productive, so they cost more. And productivity in things like education really has not budged in decades. So the kind of stuff that Elliot's been talking about in terms of disruptive models and technology, it's not, people think of this in terms of a discretionary thing. Wouldn't it be cool if we could leverage technology? It's really not an option. We have to learn how to do it, or education under our current model gets dramatically more expensive.
So I'm going to ask one more and we're going to open it up. And I'm curious, just a short, simple answer. Hypothetically, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about public education, one thing, what would it be?
The elected nature of local school boards. I think the fact that we fund education based on zip codes and based on political factors, the fact that people sometimes are electing the largest employee in their county, or the largest employer in their county, is a persistent, methodical threat to equity for all students. That's one of the things that we are actively fighting against, although we don't advertise it as such. But our model is designed to take some of the politics out, and again, not take it away from the people in that place. We actually are trying to hand education directly over to citizens in that area. But the fact that there's a political entity placed on top of that decision making that is, again, an intermediary between that and the actual technical bureaucratic process is insane.
Anybody else have one?
I mean, I think governance is a really, Fordham started working governance when I was there. We called it the most important, least sexy issue in education. I would say weighted student funding would be what I would do. I would want every dollar that is spent on a kid's education to follow that kid, whether it's a voucher for private education, whether it's charter schools, whether it's district. I'm not aware of any jurisdiction in the country where charter funding is actually on par with district funding. Maybe New Orleans,
Maybe.
but it's certainly not DC, and DC is the second largest charter sector in the country. But I think that would drive really dramatic outcomes. And we have situations now where, within a district, because the most experienced teachers teach at the schools where candidly rich white and Asian folks go to school, and the least experienced teachers teach in the predominantly black schools. You have these crazy resource allocation situations where we think we're spending more money on core instruction, we're actually spending more money per student per course on electives, we spend more money on rich kids, not poor kids. If dollars followed the kid with weights for poverty, English language learner status, special education, I think you'd see dramatically different outcomes. That might be second to school boards, but I'll use my airtime for the number 2 issue.
It's always a tough kind of question to answer. I mean, one thing that'd be interesting is, if we decoupled facilities ownership from the district. Right now, districts own facilities and manage facilities, and it's like, why, if you're about educating students, like, why are you in the business of managing buildings? And that would be in some ways not such a crazy change. We essentially would have a city agency that's responsible for maximizing the value and utility of those buildings. And now you let the district focus on the business of educating kids, and you let whoever else is in that business use those buildings. So, I mean, that would be it's not a so far-fetched of a concept, and maybe we might see it popping up in some of our cities.
Well, continuing on the list of not sexy issues, so one thing that education does really poorly is professional development. It's something that we spend an incredible amount of time on, an incredible amount of money at kind of all levels, and it's something that we do incredibly badly, which as someone who used to be a teacher, is also really embarrassing that the teaching profession can't teach itself to be better. And so I would say that if I could kind of wave a wand, I'd want a significant amount of research dollars to be pushed into how we can do professional development effectively and efficiently. That's something that I feel like we've had a bunch of research studies around professional development. They've been very discouraging, but in the last couple of years, you've seen a couple of glimmers of light. And so looking more closely at those glimmers of light and figuring out what we can do that will help make our teachers better. There's a lot of conversation these days around kind of firing low-performing teachers, and I'll tell you that is really important. But you're not going to fire your way to the top. And so figuring out how to take that middle 80% and moving them up is incredibly important.
And I'll just throw mine out. Mine would be the prestige of the sector as a whole. So that the most prestigious sector to work in is teaching. I mean, it's just the education sector as a whole. So it's teaching. It's working as a manager or leader in the sector. Whatever your gifts are, using them in education versus using them somewhere else. I think that would have a huge impact. So I'm now going to open it up. So questions? Yeah.
So one of the themes that I've heard in the panels today is this discussion of the ability to allow entrepreneurs and people to go out and experiment and find what models that work, and how that is obviously a very beneficial thing to do in all different industries and sectors. However, so my concern and my question regarding education is, how do you balance both the continual imposing of regulations and new models and new ideas onto schools, balance that with charter schools and the experimentation that's been allowed and the successes that have been seen, rolling those up so that you're actually creating this larger vision that everybody is collaborating on and pulling the things that have worked and the things that have failed, and allowing it to assist in creating a system where there's an ability to test things and to roll things out and to pull out best practices. Because I wonder whether, or maybe this is a question, like it seems to be very divided in terms of policy development and just saying, okay, so we're going to try No Child Left Behind, and then we're going to try Common Core, and then we're going to try this, and we're going to impose all of these things, and then we're going to let charter schools run off and do what they do. But how do you kind of roll it all together so that we're actually creating a larger vision of what education is going to look like you were saying, in the next 10, 20 years? Are we actually bringing everything together so that we're going to reach that vision, or are things kind of just remaining scattered?
So,
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple key things. One, I think if we have a unifying vision of education as a society in 10 years, it will not have come out of a Senate education committee. I think it will have come out of the fact that people have begun to receive education and demand education that they've seen, and have begun to demand it of their local education systems and of their state education systems in such a way where it is so self-evident that it is a shared vision, that there is no choice for people in Washington, people at State Departments to kind of get behind that demand. And I think that's the way that change will happen. I think it's the way it must happen. I think when we talk about kind of the pockets and the competing priorities of these experimentations, I think one of the key things is that there are always kind of fundamental constraints on what's going to happen in the space. If you touch federal dollars, right, anything that you do is going to have certain minimum requirements. And if you touch state dollars, it's going to have certain minimum requirements. I think the interesting questions are for the education space. If you go and look at the for-profit education startup sector, kind of more San Francisco, West Coast, it's begun to kind of move into cities like Boston, New York, New Orleans, and Chicago. What you see is that there are people who are doing direct-to-consumer models for the first time. And it's hard to be in that space because we've set up a system that is funding with public tax dollars so much money directly to the schools. And everything is designed because that funding stream dictates these hundreds of billions of dollars every year. But I think as we start to go towards kind of this vision, I think what you're going to have is either growing dissatisfaction, a decrease of those funds due to other budget constraints, in a way that is going to allow people to actually vote with dollars, not in an equitable way, right? People who have the dollars will get the choices first, but people will vote with their dollars, not just have as they've done with private schools, but in ways that augment, supplement, and really expand on what that education looks like. And I think eventually if we get to a vision, it's going to be because whether we like it or not, changes are going to come, people are going to demand them, and we will be forced into some of them as well. In that, the place for policy is going to be to make sure that all of those things reflect, to the extent we agree, what we think is needed for safety of students, and for ultimately some kind of more abstract elements about what we think a student and a citizen should look like. And that conversation is harder, it's more abstract, but it definitely is a product of what policies we put in place. And I think having that conversation at the higher levels will kind of drive some of those smaller, more local decisions kind of down the line to the closest to communities we get.
I'm sort of skeptical of grand visions, honestly. I mean, people don't fret about, like, how can we broadly improve quality in the restaurant space. People just pick McDonald's or Danes or Nana's or whatever and go and spend their dollars, right? And I think, in terms of districts versus charters, people talk about, well, they're sort of hard to reach kids that charters don't want to serve, et cetera. There's some truth to that. But I think if authorizers are smart and incentivize serving all students and figure out how to motivate folks to take up different niches, like KIPP doesn't need to take over 100% of schools for the sector to do well. KIPP will take the 10 or 15 or 30%, whatever it is in a given city that works well with their model and that they can really get excited about their schools. Other models will take other pieces. I think honestly the only thing that districts do well that charters might not be able to beat them at is sort of already high-performing schools in well-off neighborhoods. So I personally see no problem with the district sector sort of withering. And I think that sort of matches with history. Like, historically, you don't see entrenched giant organizations import best practices from elsewhere and get dramatically better.
And just to piggyback off Chris, I think you'll see in 10, 15 years that scattered is the vision. Because I think choice is going to flood the education sector, in my personal opinion. Look at our lives as Americans. We demand choice in absolutely every aspect of our lives. What do we eat? What do we wear? What do we drive? What computer do we use? What phone do we use? And then all of a sudden, education, you have no choice. It's you go to your neighborhood school. And I think as we get more and more choice in our lives, and we get less and less satisfied with the choice in an area where we have no choice. And so personally, I think you'll see choice over time start to be, that there are different ways of choice other than just charters. You can have choice within a district. You'll see different things evolve, but I think you'll see scattered becomes tradition, in my opinion.
The thing that I'll say though is that this conversation looks very different in a rural area than an urban area. You know, when you're talking about a market, a market can function pretty well. Even in schools where kind of information maybe isn't everyone doesn't have access to the same information, a market can function relatively well in a city like a DC or New Orleans. In rural North Carolina where I taught, there was one high school in a district, and even more broadly, there were limits to, like, even if you dissolved the district's poof, there was limits to how far students could travel. There simply wasn't the population concentration that would allow for a choice environment like you have in DC or New Orleans. That said, online education will definitely enter into the space. But I think that instead of looking at kind of everyone will have choices, I think you'll see communities and states making decisions about how they want their schools to look and having more flexibility about what those choices are. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if many districts continue to kind of stay on a similar model with additional changes.
All right. Yeah.
This is actually a perfect tie into what the question I had, which is around the idea of choice. I started thinking about it when Elliot, when you were talking about the idea of healthcare, because it seems like even still within that model, it represents a lot of privilege, right? Like me, I'm middle class white. I know my options, and I know that if I'm sick, I know that I can just call my primary care physician and probably get an appointment the next day. And if I'm really sick, go to urgent care, and I have a car, so I can drive to all of these different places. I know my resources. I can take my insurance card to the pharmacy. And if I didn't have that A, knowledge, but B, all of the access to those resources, my only option, even though those other choices might exist, they're not accessible to me. I can't just, the ER might be the only option that's a viable source for me, just like when you're talking about, as Americans, we want options for food. Like, I can choose to drive to Trader Joe's or drive to wherever, but if I'm on, the WIC program, I might only be able to get to one grocery store and get this limited choice. So I think, how do we recognize that or reconcile that around education? I mean, if I'm in a neighborhood and my 4 choices of schools in my neighborhood are all just 4 equally bad, is that really a choice? Like, and how do we manage that, particularly when we look at the lowest, population, the most needy population that doesn't have access to that information?
And so I think this is where the exciting confluence of kind of historic factors comes together as well. So the exciting part, if you think about education versus healthcare as we know it in the United States is built around this strange decision to bundle healthcare benefits with employment. That we've never seemed to have gotten over, right? And we are now starting to move towards the idea of extending healthcare as a more public good. I think the interesting thing, no matter where your political affiliation lies, is we already believe in socialized education, right? We already believe that there is a fundamental unalienable right to have everyone get access to a high-quality education. It's just that we don't actually do it, right? We don't know when it's not convenient. But the funding is there, and the fact that there are other factors that keep that from meaning quality everywhere is kind of a secondary structural concern. But there's money for every kid to go to a school and to get the education. So the question is, if you're in healthcare and choice for you is a matter of privilege, it's because you have some set of resources that are uniquely yours, that are not equitable, that are not guaranteed at this point, or above and beyond that. And that will continue to be the case. People will, consume more education or get fancier, nicer private schools. But there's going to be this idea where if you can take those same dollars and resources that are being tied to this public education system and free them for those same people who are kind of forced into consuming poor quality options to really open up, I think what you've got is this untapped market for those dollars to go to things that much more closely reflect what those people want and need that just aren't possible, right? They can't send any signals about what they would actually prefer to have. So if there's 4 awful options, and then all of a sudden there's more flexibility within the 5th option, now you're going to have some sorting, you're going to have some signals, you're going to have some incentive to meet those needs. Whereas right now, we put all of the resources of that socialized education system, to use a scary term, but we don't allow it to actually send us any messages about what quality would look like in the eyes of the people who are actually using it. And I think that is the key difference. combined with the fact that historically we're now able to do things in rural education or with online education, where the information infrastructure will continue to make things, I think, exponentially more possible, more options possible. I think that kind of confluence will be the interesting place where we'll have really plentiful, high-quality options for lots of people that we weren't counting on a generation ago.
I would say I'm just going to say two totally contradictory things, and I don't know how you're not smart enough to connect them together. I mean, the one thing is it's absolutely true that a lot of the most needy communities don't know how to access resources, they don't know how to unpack information about school quality, right? That's even really, frankly, hard in wealthy neighborhoods. I mean, GreatSchools.net and some other organizations are kind of trying to sit into that space, but that's just really hard, and it's especially hard in needy neighborhoods. I think there are, like the Public Charter School Board in DC now releases like these sort of, they've got like an iPhone app, they've got like a mobile website folks can access from cell phones. They're trying to sort of build capacity in that. But I think the totally contradictory thing I would say is that these communities have a lot more resources and tacit knowledge and just frankly like power and passion behind how their kids are educated than a lot of well-meaning middle class folks from outside think they do, and a lot of the things that keep them from exercising smart choice are not their lack of smartness, but these sort of one-size-fits-all structures that sit on top of the system. If your kid might have some kind of learning disability, they're either special ed or they're not. It's very hard to navigate what that looks like and try to influence the resources your kid gets or the services they get. There's a whole host of other issues like that, where it's like it's either one or the other, and if you have a smart third way to solve your kid's problems, even in a charter, it's hard for us to be responsive to our parents on that, whether it's our own being stuck in the mud or whether it's responsiveness to other compliance things. It's just hard.
All right, next question. Right there, and then we're done.
So I'm at the Stanford School across the street, and in our spring semester we have to do a spring consulting project. And the question we've been asked to solve from a governmental entity is how to use their current salary structure without raising the cost to increase the recruitment and retention of high-quality teachers. And so while I would love to hear your responses on that specifically, what I'm really curious about is actually whether that is one of the main questions you would be asking if you were a governmental entity at this point. And if not, what are some of the big questions you would be asking?
There you go.
So that's incredibly important. But I'll tell you that if there's one thing that the teachers unions hold near and dear to their hearts, it's the salary schedule, because it ensures that there's a clear way of paying people that isn't subject to bias, really. So how a teaching salary schedule works is that you get bonuses based on, or you get raises based on how many years you work and also based on your level of education. So if you go back and you get a master's degree, in many cases in anything, you get a bump in your salary. So this is something that I think teachers, both teachers and kind of district level people are starting to look at pretty closely. And moving more towards performance pay. Which is, the better you are in terms of your evaluation results, in terms of your student achievement results, the more you get paid. That said, all the research tells us that performance pay actually doesn't make people better, but make teachers better. But in my opinion, it's the right way to do it because you want to pay your better teachers better than your not as good teachers. So this is an incredibly important issue. The kind of obviously sensible, or the immediately sensible things in terms of your question, are getting rid of raises for master's degrees and advanced degrees, except for perhaps, I think there has been some research around science and math masters, but other than that, getting rid of them. There has been some evidence that actually our professors over at the Stanford School did in terms of raises, or in terms of national board certified. So it's this year-long process that you go through in order to prove you're an effective teacher. It also hasn't been proven to make teachers better, but it is an indicator of quality. And so paying those teachers more, I think, makes a lot of sense. In terms of the recruitment piece, front-loading some of the salary. As a first-year teacher, I made $28,000, which you can live on quite nicely in rural North Carolina, but not anywhere else. So front-loading some of that salary. Chris might also talk about the pension situation that's kind of enfolded into all this. But those are kind of my first glance thoughts.
So we got 9 minutes, so we're going to do lightning round as quick as we possibly can. 1 question, 1 answer, 1 question, 1 answer. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, I was just really interested in what Elliot had kind of said about, human development needing to be more of a priority and thinking about like other areas of development other than just academic development. And I feel like a lot of that's missing from the conversation on education reform because maybe there aren't clear, easy metrics around it. So just wondering thoughts on, what those metrics might look like or how to start making that more of the conversation.
So, lightning round answer.
Yeah.
I'm totally unqualified to answer it. But I would say education is one of the human functions that's happened for millennia. And what we have to decide is, do we have a clear sense of what we want our adults in society to look like? And if so, we can figure out ways to measure if we're doing a good job of that or not. Right now, we have no theory about what we actually want people to look like outside of very specific indicators that are marginally attached to the things that we actually spend our days doing. And so I think it's a very complicated conversation, but one that I think is worth having more centrally to the education discussion.
Next question.
I'd love to touch briefly on higher education and your thoughts on where you see innovation, whether it's competency-based models like Western Governors, more online like Rio Salato. Where are you seeing innovation and how tightly connected is it to what's happening in K-12?
I could take that one. So I think like the traditional four-year sector is not a place to look for innovation. I think it's just a disaster. I'm a free marketer. I'm very ideological about that. I think that the for-profit higher ed sector is just a cesspool. Ideologically, I would love for that to be a great place of innovation. It is proven to just be a place to suck profits out of the neediest students in the higher ed system. For me, the places that stuff is happening is interesting. Community colleges are still a bit establishment, but they're starting to do really interesting things. You're starting to see early college models where you have high schools that bridge to college coursework, often on campus, on the high school campus, which I think is really interesting. And so my Angelou, we just started this year a young adult learning center, which has pre-GED, GED, and workforce development. And I think that's really interesting. I think folks sort of poo-poo those models because it's like, oh, sure, you're building skills, but higher ed is about more than just building skills. It's about sort of education of the whole person, liberal arts stuff. I think that is important, but I think people still think of higher ed as like a one and done or twice and done kind of thing. Like I did a bachelor's degree, I did an MBA at Duke, I'm not done with higher ed. I think what workforce does is it sort of bridges to more of a lifelong learner model. And so like we see kids who have been disconnected, they come back to the young adult learning center to get their GED, then they do some workforce stuff. And what that enables them to do is not be done with their post-secondary education and have a career, but to get that first job that then gets them reconnected and earning a paycheck. They then enroll in community college, and that can bridge to a whole variety of things, trade, four-year schools, a whole bunch of stuff. So I think outside of four-year schools is where you're going to see the most interesting stuff happening.
Next question.
This one maybe for Sarah, or if anybody else wants to answer to it. How is sequestration possibly going to affect, in a positive way, possibly, if you can speak to it, in any way, could it be a positive thing?
So,
maybe play devil's advocate.
Sure. Well, I'll actually, maybe this isn't the answer you're looking for, but I'll defer to Chris's answer on this one when he was talking about kind of tightened financial straits and how school districts are responding to that, and the answer is not well. And so do I think that there are some innovative districts out there and we're going to use the opportunity that discretionary cuts are going to give them? Absolutely not. So I hope that I am wrong. I really do. And maybe if someone else has some more optimistic predictions.
If it's any consolation, there's almost no evidence that money has anything to do with educational outcomes on the way up, and most likely on the way down as well. Granted, you can use on the way down to make really bad decisions and kind of mess it up on purpose and make a case for more money later, but in the reality of it, I don't think it's going to be the critical hit that people are ready to do.
I'll be wildly optimistic. There's what, like 7,000 school districts in the U.S., 8,000? There might be 2. So that's my wildly optimistic.
All right. A couple more questions here.
I was wondering if any of you had thoughts on arts education, especially as you talk about funding disappearing. It's often a place that's hit hard first, though when you look at innovation in a space that's looked to as maybe incentivizing kids towards a larger picture or something like that. What's its place and how will it kind of evolve in a rapidly changing field?
I mean,
So this is maybe one of the, I mean, there's definitely a casualty of arts, and we've gotten so standards focused in public education that there's been an impoverishment to some extent in curriculum. And I think where it's hit the hardest is in underserved communities, because that's where the accountability is like, oh, they gotta be doing double blocks of reading and math. So I mean, there is a lot of research out there, I think, that points to the value of having arts and having physical education and having things that we're skinnying down. I think what I guess the opportunity out there is that if we have new models, and as you find ways to make the school day look better and have success, people want that. I mean, you're going to kids want that, parents want that for their kids. So I think it's going to come back. It's taken a hit the last 10 years, last 15 years. I don't know what you want.
And I would say the important thing to remember with arts and music and these things is that they don't go away from the communities. Hopefully they don't go away from students' lives, right? There's a huge opportunity to be able to tap into the fact that our schools don't reflect reality in that sense, right? When we cut PE or we cut art or cut music from a school, it's not like we're actually depriving students of those things. There are opportunities to participate, yes, if they miss out, but there are also incredibly diverse ways to get similar experiences. And so I don't think the conversation will ever be about budget cuts and then let's add back in the same classes we had. I think it's going to be much more about when we open up opportunities, why don't we take art history courses exclusively in museums if you have them in your city, right? Like, let's talk about why that's not feasible in our system and like why that makes no sense whatsoever. Or if you have, local musicians that are playing around a school and not in a school, why does that happen? Why does our school insist on that artificial boundary between the things that we want our children exposed to and the things that they participate on the inside? I think it's a possibility.
Yes.
All of you talked about human capital, the importance of human capital. How do we encourage those individuals who are in college now or may go to college in the next few years to think about teaching as a profession? I was a pre-major advisor at Duke for a number of years, and every time I had an advisee who indicated she or he wanted to go in the classroom, I celebrated. Few of them stayed. And a lot of them never went because society discouraged them. So how do we do it? I know salary is one thing, but there's got to be some way we can get some of the best and the brightest, or more of the best and the brightest in the classroom. I think we're not looking to the future until we do that.
So Sarah probably has a smarter answer than I have. A suspiciously simple two-part answer. Pay them more and treat them like professionals. I think we've been class size reduction has been this specter over the last 10 or 15 years. A number of states or localities have either mandated lower class sizes or have just targeted lower class sizes. And what it's meant is we have poorer quality teachers entering the classroom and they get paid less, because when you add teachers with a fixed budget, you have to pay them less, right? So I think we need to be smarter about letting class sizes tick up, using technology, other things like that, to be able to pay highly effective teachers more. I think money does not improve our existing base of teachers, but I think there's promise for it to attract higher quality teachers to enter the profession. And in terms of professionalism, though, this is a little bit of an ideological point, but most teachers are unionized. They get treated by these sort of vanilla collective bargaining agreements. They're not just, there's no ability typically or there's no ability, or even when there's ability, there's no culture of distinguishing among sort of poor teachers and great teachers and having different outcomes for them. They're rewarded for doing stuff like going to a sort of paper mill 2-year master's degree instead of getting really meaningful graduate education. So there's just a whole bunch of stuff where, I want teachers to be treated as professionals, but I don't think the system does treat them that way.
Well, and I'll say that in a lot of the conversations, the union is kind of the big nasty monster in the room. North Carolina isn't unionized, and I'll tell you that there is not a whole lot of difference between North Carolina and some of the more unionized states. So I think what Chris was talking about in terms of treating teachers like professionals is incredibly important. Part of that means paying them like professionals, so paying more effective teachers better. Part of that means raising the selection criteria in terms of who can become a teacher. That's something that unions and most recently this past week, the teacher preparation or the schools of teacher preparation got together and released a report saying that they were in favor of raising standards to get into teacher preparation programs. So that's something that I feel like even people that typically put on the brakes, that's something they're in favor of, and that's something that we should do. And I think once teacher evaluation is more meaningful, one's pay reflects quality, it'll be a place where teachers want to teach. And you see that in a place like KIPP, honestly. One thing that a lot of high-performing, to look at kind of high-performing charters though, one thing that they haven't done very well, in my opinion, is make the job sustainable. A lot of my friends, at least, who are KIPP teachers, they loved it. They loved the kids, they loved the people they worked with, they felt excited to go to work every day, but they were burned out. So figuring out whether that's using technology or leveraging some other kind of alternative school structure, helping to make sure these kind of high-performing charter schools retain their teachers, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, and just one final note, because I know we're running so close. That just, if you think about what we think of as a professional career, it involves a couple of things. One of those is interacting with adults, and one of those is having reasonable hours. And the enemy, teachers unions are there to protect teachers from a terrible situation that is perpetuated by schools. I think until a teacher has an ability not just to make more money, but to say, I'm coming in to work, and then over time, instead of just doing the same job for slightly more pay each year, I'm going to share responsibilities vertically. That, I think, that is the only way you will make teaching a sustainable long-term position, and not to say something that people who only, if you want to have an adult conversation, teaching is not an option for you right now. It just can't be.
So before I turn it over to Maddie, I just want to say, on this human capital note, we need each and every one of you to work in public education. So please consider it. There's so much work to be done, and it's worthwhile work. You can make a good living and make an impact in the education sector. I have to do that as education pioneers because I believe it so firmly. And like I said, our application is going live again tomorrow. If you're interested, even for a summer placement this summer, in our high-need areas in the South. And so if you want to make an impact this summer, please go to educationpioneers.org, and you can still apply again, starting again tomorrow for this summer.
And I'll just put it, I'll expose Megan and myself and Ben as alums. And so if anybody's questions.
Right, yeah, both of my post-Fuqua jobs through education pioneers. So.
Love it.
John doesn't even pay me to say that.
Well, I'm going to cut everybody off. This was such an incredibly inspiring conversation, and I wanted to hopefully give you guys a couple minutes to mingle with our wonderful panelists and moderator before we cut things off. Two quick things. First of all, a logistical thing. Elliot is going to be one of our closing TED speakers, so hopefully you all will join us in Janine at the end of the day to hear him give some thoughts on some innovative stuff that's been happening with his organization and also in New Orleans. And also, I wanted to say thank you. We have a small token of our appreciation for each one of you. This is a local artisan poster from our event for today. So
thank you.
Small thanks, but really an incredible conversation. Obviously, for me, this is something that's really exciting, and I'm so glad that I got each one of you guys here today. So round of applause and thanks so much.